Our first lesson today is from Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verses 19 through 22. This is on page 310 in your Pew Bible. Listen for the word of the Lord. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Our second scripture lesson today comes from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 6 through 18. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Even if I thought there was hope. No, return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought that there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand was turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. As of Thursday, March 18th, over 3 million refugees have fled Ukraine. As the shelling of civilian buildings has increased, so has the flow of people heading out of the country. Most of the people who are fleeing Ukraine are women and children. There are stories of families crossing the Ukrainian border only to have the men kiss their wives and their children goodbye and then to head back into Ukraine to defend their homes and their neighborhoods. But not everyone who is fleeing this war instigated by Russia are white-skinned Caucasians. Other people who were students and guests in Ukraine are fleeing the shelling and the fighting too. And there are people who are treating these strangers as friends, people who are trying to help them. Now, one of the people that I know, a minister colleague from when I had my church in Allegan, the Reverend Scott Parmenter, is currently serving as a pastor in the International Christian Fellowship Church in Warsaw, Poland. When the fighting began around Kyiv, the universities closed. And while many Ukrainian students were able to go back to their homes and their families in rural Ukraine, the foreign students were immediately left stranded. They had nowhere to go. Overnight, they became refugees and they fled westward away from the war. Some of the students ended up in Warsaw, Poland, where they were directed to the International Christian Fellowship. Pastor Scott had helped his congregation turn their church building into a refugee housing center. That first morning, February 27th, Scott was expecting 15 refugees. He called out for his church members to drop off sleeping bags. By 3:30 that same afternoon, there were 23 students camped out in his church building. By March 2nd, International Christian Fellowship was averaging 35 people a night coming through his church. The highest number they've had is 85. Most of the initial people arriving were people of color. They stayed just long enough to get their travel arrangements in order, and then they headed off to either another university or else they went back home to their own countries. There has been a steady stream of people, refugees, walking through their church doors. Angie, Scott's wife, wrote on Facebook, "Among the overnight arrivals was a mom who was one of the medical students with her 2 young kids. All they had were PJs, no coats. It's still winter here, 26 degrees overnight last night. Among the donations, my hubby Scott found clothes their sizes and a big, warm, long, puffy coat, just the little boy's size. He jumped up and down with delight and was running all around the church in his new coat because he was so excited." When people are refugees or displaced persons because of wars, it is not always possible to go back home. Pastor Scott writes, "The look in their eyes, I don't think I will ever forget. They're blank. They're empty. When you give them something, they're grateful, but very little emotion, because they're just in shock, I think, over what has happened to them." Unfortunately, this sort of thing has happened in Ukraine before. Becoming refugees is what happened to my own family, the Fitz family. You see, they were ethnic German settlers who were living in northwest Ukraine in the region called Volhynia. Their 100-acre farm was near the town of Rosishka. The invasion of the region in 1939 by Hitler's German army resulted in the brutal murder of many Polish people. So the relationships in 1945 between the Polish people and the German settlers was terrible. The Polish did not like the German settlers, and many people wanted revenge for what had been done to them. On January 2nd, 1945, my father was just 4 years old when the Fitz family could hear the Russian guns in the distance. The front of the war was coming. They needed to get out. So they loaded up their farm wagon with their valuables and food, including a big sack of flour and a big pot of pork grease drippings. They included oats and hay for their 2 big draft horses. Then my Oma and Opa set the horses off down the road with their 5 children. They were leaving most everything that they owned behind. Their goal was to get to Opa's sister's house in Germany, but they did not know which roads would lead them there safely. One night, the Fitz family stopped at a brick schoolhouse at a crossroad. Many other refugees had stopped there for the night also. They had pushed all the school benches to one side in order to make room for people to sleep on the floor. Suddenly, they heard gunshots. You could see the flames from the end of the rifles at a distance, and they were coming toward them. As they looked more closely through the night, they could tell that it was a farm truck with high sides. It had men in the back with rifles who were shooting at anything that moved. The refugees thought that they were Papazan, Polish citizen militiamen out for revenge. These militias were especially searching out the German refugees. So all of the women and children fled into the schoolhouse basement. The Fitz's farm wagon was parked alongside the building, and my Opa was outside feeding their horses who were still standing in their harnesses. As everyone hid from the oncoming truck with the gunmen, my Opa laid down in the ditch and covered himself with the horses' hay. The mayor of their village was also there, sitting in his wagon, along with his wife and a Polish worker boy. The mayor did not hide, but apparently was determined to talk to the shooters. But as the militiamen came down the road and around the corner of the building, they did not stop to talk. They shot the mayor dead. They also shot his wife in her shoulder, as well as their Polish serving boy in the legs. Then the militia started shooting some of the horses tied up outside the schoolhouse. One of the Fitz's draft horses was shot dead, and the other one was hit in the back and severely injured. As the truck spun around behind the school building and left down the road, many of the refugees who still had living horses immediately took off, just in case the truck with the shooters decided to come back. But the Fitz family was stranded. They didn't know what to do. Suddenly, a young horse came running down the street. He was all spooked because of all of the shooting. My Opa held out his arms and got the young horse to stop. Then he took off his belt and put it around the young horse's neck to secure it. He calmed him down enough to get my Uncle Willie to hold him. A little while later, a second young horse came running down the road, whinnying for his lost friend. Opa caught him too and brought him over to his buddy. With the 2 young horses secured and eating oats, Opa then started the task of cutting down the draft horse-sized harnesses to fit the yearlings. But there was another huge problem. It was winter. The roads were packed ice, and the young horses would tear their feet to shreds trying to pull a wagon while unshod. But Opa had some extra draft horse shoes in the wagon, and he lit a bonfire and he started to heat them up to work on them. He bent those big horseshoes into smaller circles and then cut off the extra metal. Then, because he didn't actually have the stuff to actually fit and shoe the young horses properly with nails, Opa created long socks out of shirt sleeves, and he tied the makeshift horseshoes onto the young horses' feet with rags. By the time all this work was finished, it was the evening of the next day, and Opa took everything out of the big farm wagon. Back into the wagon went all of the kids, the feather beds, the groceries, the cooking pot, and some hand tools. They left Oma's sewing machine in the ditch. Some of their old neighbors helped them push their wagon out onto the road, and with the young horses pulling, probably for the first time in their young lives, the Fitz family kept going. At first, Opa stopped every mile or so to check that the tied-on horseshoes were working. But the young horses soon got used to them, and they were able to move the wagon slowly along. For the next 9 months, the Fitz family were refugees on the road, staying ahead of the front. They would find an empty farm and stay there for 3 or 4 weeks until they heard the guns again. They scrounged for their food and supplies, and at one point they found a 100-pound bag of sugar that had been hidden in the ashes of a fireplace. They divided this sugar into many small sacks, and they hid them all over the wagon. They used those small sacks of sugar to trade with other people, at one point scoring a beautiful new jacket for my 4-year-old father. When they finally reached the border to Germany, it was closed. It was being patrolled with soldiers and dogs, and people were not being allowed to cross without the right papers. The war ended, and Opa was willing to farm, so the Fitzes were given permission to live in half of a house in exchange for doing farm work. So they stayed, and they worked near the border for about a year. During this time, Opa also was hired to be a coachman to drive some wealthy people to meetings to help organize the new Polish government. Opa started talking to people, and he found a farmer who had property on both sides of the border. For a certain amount of money, he would legally take the whole Fitz family across the border as his workers. So that's what they did. Everything they owned was either on their person or in one small pulled handcart. Once they got into Germany, the British government had set up stock cars that would take people from the border into more populated areas. And once they were there, the Red Cross helped them to get their papers together, and they found the Fitzes a house to live in Odesheim. From there, Opa's brother sponsored them to immigrate to Coloma, Michigan, in the United States of America. It was 1952, and my dad was 10 years old. The Fitz family arrived in the USA with almost nothing. They lived in a couple of rooms in Opa's brother's basement, and they worked every job they could find until they could afford to buy a house in Benton Harbor. Their joy was complete when they finally saved enough to buy a farm of their own in Sodus, Michigan in 1958. After my Opa died in 1965, my dad bought that farm, and that's where I grew up. I played on the barn beams that were hand-hewn by my Opa. My parents still live in that farmhouse, and my brother lives next door. So, my friends, what does all of this mean for us here today? Over 40 times in the Bible, we are encouraged to care for the immigrant, the stranger among us. In Matthew 25, our text for this Lent, we are specifically instructed to take in, to welcome, and to take care of the strangers who are immigrants. We are to take care of the refugees and the homeless. We are reminded that just as the children of Israel were starving and found food and welcome in the land of Egypt, so we too are obligated to welcome the stranger as friends. Because you never know what might happen. The granddaughter of that refugee family might just grow up to be your next pastor. God, let it be so. Amen.